have to admit, I find Dune more enjoyable to discuss than to actually read. That's not to say that the Dune series isn't a great read, although God Emperor was a little bit dense. It's just that the themes presented are so well incorporated, so fascinatingly multifaceted that I could talk about them for hours. And one thing I've noticed in my hours of talking about them is that these themes are very often repeated. He confronts you with these hard-to-tackle ideas again and again throughout the story, often amplifying in magnitude when they pass from one character to the next. And yet, these echoing ideas never become dull. They never become rote. Herbert has mastered this device, this use of thematic cycles, and he uses it to make these complex ideas versatile, accessible, and universal in the very unique way that only Dune can be. This is your warning that this video is going to contain spoilers for the entire Dune series up through God Emperor of Dune. And yes, for the people in my comment section that were telling me to read God Emperor of Dune, I did, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. So if you want to avoid spoilers entirely, then go ahead and just put this on your watch later playlist and then come back to it after you've read God Emperor of Dune. But if you don't mind spoilers, I will hopefully be giving just enough context that you understand what's going on, even if you haven't read God Emperor, so, you know, watch at your own risk. The first cycle of Dune that I want to discuss is that of the very planet itself. Throughout the narrative, we see the planet Arrakis oscillating between states of moisture and desert. As revealed by the existence of huge salt pans underneath the sands of Dune, the planet was once a very water-rich one, with wide oceans as far as the eye could see. However, long before the events of Dune, sand trout were introduced to the planet. Sand trout are the larval, or basically baby phase, of the giant sandworms. They're very small, and while adult sandworms are allergic to water and just touching it will kill them, sand trout flourish in it. They form bubbles of moisture underground, linking together their bodies to create a protective seal, where they flourish until that bubble grows and grows and bursts, scattering sand trout across the sand, ready to become sandworms. In this way, sandworms are this very independent life cycle that causes desertification, the young keeping the planet dry for the old. On Arrakis, this process scoured life from the planet's entire surface, creating Dune as we know it. It was this environment where the Fremen carved out their fearsome way of life. The harsh desert storms, the fierce battle for limited resources, and the constant threat of worms hardened the Fremen into something nearly superhuman. Dune acted as a crucible, instilling their most fundamental lessons. The Fremen were supreme in that quality the ancients called Spannungsbogen, which is the self-imposed delay between desire for a thing and the act of reaching out to grasp that thing. Of all the desert taught them, this Spannungsbogen, this dedicated patience, is what gives Fremen their edge, their desert power. And nowhere does this manifest more clearly than in their relationship to the planet's ecology. When the Kyneses, the planetary ecologists for Arrakis, discovered the life cycle of the worms and their relationship to the desert, they realized the potential for Arrakis to return to being a water-rich paradise. They promised the Fremen that if they helped them, one day, Dune would be green and flourishing. The Fremen agreed, even with the knowledge that this process may take 500 years. They were not strangers to delayed gratification. The Kyneses noted that this desperation, this devotion to a dream, was very similar to religious devotion, and they were quick to capitalize on this. Pardo Kynes taught his son, "Religion and law amongst our masses must be one and the same. An act of disobedience must be a sin and require religious penalties. This will have the dual benefit of bringing both greater obedience and greater bravery." The Bene Gesserit witches also took note of the Fremen's proclivity for unquenchable faith. They commandeered their ecological dreams and seeded religious notions of a messiah, a voice from the outer world that would come to deliver them. It's only once their Lisan al-Gaib, Paul Atreides, arrives and the change finally starts to take place on Arrakis that the Fremen realize just how precarious their position was. If they had been fueled all along for centuries by yearning, what happens to them when their desires are fulfilled? If the desert made the Fremen, then what happens when the desert is unmade? Chani, Paul's lover and the quintessential Fremen woman, is one of the first people to feel this wind of change. Atop her sietch home, about to give birth, she watches the desert and the passing of the great sandworms, all of which will be rendered impossible by terraforming efforts. She hated water then, inspired by the worm's fear. Water, once the spirit soul of Arrakis, had become a poison. Water brought pestilence. Only the desert was clean. This ill portent proves true. As the Atreides establish themselves as the theocratic rulers of the Empire, Arrakis, and thus the Fremen, transform before their very eyes. Once dry, emaciated flesh becomes plump and rich with water. Stillsuits become a fashion choice rather than a tool for survival. Their homes, which were previously simple caves under the ground, were now above ground with windows to look out upon the sand and let the heat of the day in. When the need for survival was removed from the equation, the Fremen quickly abandoned their old ways, their old beliefs, their old discipline. This problem becomes all the more dire when Paul's son, Leto II, takes on immortal godhood and completes Dune's transformation. By the time of God Emperor of Dune, over 3,000 years later, Arrakis is unrecognizable. It's rich with forests and rivers, and the only remaining section of desert is kept that way because of weather-controlling machines. The remaining Fremen are what they call museum Fremen, essentially reenactors living in imitation sietches, bearing plastic replica crysknives. They know the words of the old rituals, but they don't even know how they're pronounced or what they mean. Herbert makes it clear that without the desert, without the true, unforgiving desert of Dune, it is impossible for Fremen to be Fremen. Leto II, fueled with an intimate knowledge of humanity's future, allowed this to happen in order to teach humanity a lesson. No one wants to have to survive. Everybody wants surplus, they want plenty, they want to limit suffering. So, Leto II gives them that. His reign is complete and very sterile. People live in regulation villages, they follow the same rules, they worship the same god. Conflict and strife are eliminated. But by giving humanity everything it supposedly yearned for on a golden platter, Leto showed us how we atrophy without the chance to flex our muscles. In the end, all that Leto longs for is for his reign to come to an end and for the desert to retake Arrakis. Watercourses will fill with sand, crops will be choked and killed, trees will be covered by great moving dunes. The sand death will spread. But what of the people, Lord? All of the people. Many will die. Food plants and the abundant growth of this land will be parched. Without nourishment, meat animals will die. Will everyone go hungry, Lord? Undernourishment and the old diseases will stalk the land, while only the hardiest survive. The hardiest and most brutal. Must that be, Lord? The alternatives are worse. Crucibles are hot and painful, but they are necessary. The new green of Arrakis leaves no room for struggle, for conflict, for spiritual growth. Leto believed that the desert was the only place where the human mind could truly be free, where we could fill the utter silence with thought. Thus, Arrakis would have to become Dune again. At the end of God Emperor, Leto's final action is to release the last of the sand trout back into the ecosystem of Arrakis. They infest the water, ready to begin the cycle again, ready to suck the planet dry. Dune will be taken over by sand, and the Fremen will have the opportunity to be hardened again into what they once were, true desert warriors. And the cycle begins again. The story of ecology on Arrakis is one of desires and desires satiated. It is human nature to want, to yearn, but we have to keep in mind and to think forward to what we're going to do if those desires are actually fulfilled. If we allow ourselves to be a people fueled by yearning, then what happens when those needs are finally met? The importance of yearning, of keeping the object of one's desire out of your grasp, is repeated in another very important theme: the tragedy of love in Dune. This terrible cycle finds its roots in the relationship between the Duke Leto and Lady Jessica. The two of them love each other. It's obvious, but they do have to maintain a degree of distance. On the surface, this is because the Duke must remain unmarried, available for a convenient political union. However, this does go a bit deeper. When pressed, Jessica admits, the Duke is really two men. One of them I love very much. He's charming, witty, considerate, tender. Everything a woman could desire. But the other man is cold, callous, demanding, selfish, as harsh and cruel as a winter wind. The Duke's position of power requires him to be something other than the loving, tender partner that Jessica wishes him to be. She remains his concubine and not his wife, and Jessica feels this enforced separation acutely. At the beginning of Dune, when the Reverend Mother reminds Jessica to keep her emotional distance, she breaks down. A dry sob shook her. In a low voice, she said, "I've been so lonely." "It should be one of the tests," the old woman said. "Humans are almost always lonely." This bleak outlook, this slavish obedience to duty over joy, is passed on to her son. Paul loves the Fremen woman Chani in a way that defies belief. She is his entire world, the love of his life, and yet, just like his father, he is unable to make that bond permanent, to make it official. He marries the Princess Irulan, and in a sad echo of his parents, the woman that he truly loves, Chani, must remain simply a concubine. Although Jessica tries to soothe this wound, reminding Chani that history will look back at them as having been their partner's true wives, this does little to soothe that wound. At the end of Dune Messiah, Paul's prescience, his ability to see into the future, reveals to him that Chani will die in childbirth. He tries to put off the inevitable. He allows the Princess Irulan to secretly feed her contraceptives in order to put this future off, but in the end, he must choose his destiny over her. She gives birth to the twins, Ganima and Leto II, and dies in the process. It's this loss that breaks Paul, that destroys his connection to prescience. Chani was gone, never to return. The air, the universe, all vacant, everywhere vacant. Was this the essence of his penance? He tried to recapture the timeless mind dilation of the melange, but awareness fell short. No burst of the future came into this new consciousness. He felt himself rejecting the future, any future. "Goodbye, my Sihaya," he whispered. Paul knows that someone needs to be strong enough to guide humanity onto its golden path. He knows that there is one narrow way forward, one path for humanity to be led on that will ensure their future survival, but by the time of Chani's death, he cannot shoulder that burden. He wanders into the desert without gear, food, or water, ready to submit to its cleansing power. Still, the choices he made, allowing Chani to give birth to the twins, means that there will be someone there to take up that yoke. His sister Aliyah laments the position that Paul has been put in, trapped in this crux between duty and love, and unable to fully commit to either. He had but to step off the track. What matter that the rest of the universe would have come shattering down behind him? He'd have been safe, and Chani with him. Then why didn't he? "For the love of heaven," she whispered. Then more loudly she said, "Paul's entire life was a struggle to escape his jihad and its deification. At least he's free of it. He chose this." Aliyah understands this struggle, this awful tension between responsibility and joy, better than anyone. Due to the actions of her mother, the Lady Jessica, she underwent the spice trance, the inundation of melange that opened her mind, whilst still in the womb. Her unformed head was filled with the consciousness and memories of every single one of her ancestors, and she was born with the mind of an adult, with the mind of thousands of adults. Between her status of being preborn, of undergoing the spice trance in the womb, and the fact that she was Paul's sister, she never had a chance at any semblance of a childhood, and this had disastrous consequences. At only 15 years old, Aaliyah has no one except for a mother that fears her and a brother who everyone thinks is God. She's treated by her followers as a god, as a saint, but no one thinks to treat her as a human. I didn't want to be different. I wanted to be able to laugh, she whispered. Tears slid down her cheeks. But I'm sister to an emperor who's worshipped as a god. People fear me. I never wanted to be feared. I don't want to be a part of history, she whispered. I just want to be loved. And to love. It's this yearning for love, this desperation to be treated like a human being, that causes Aaliyah to fall. She was pursued by fear and loneliness through her entire youth, so when the voices in her head grew louder and louder, she turned to them for comfort. Aaliyah is possessed by the mind of the Baron Harkonnen, her grandfather, and is twisted into a terrible despot grasping for power. And by the time anyone realizes this has happened to her, it is far too late to save Aaliyah. Paul is too wrapped up in the consequences of his own actions, and Jessica apologizes, but it's futile. Leto II and Ghanima are also preborn like Aaliyah, but they look at her as something to avoid, as a warning sign. I pity her, Ghanima said. The lore of it must have been subtle and insidious, creeping up on her until... She's a victim, yes, Leto said. Abomination. In the end, Aaliyah manages to gain back just enough control that she can throw herself off of a precipice, lonely to her final breath. This loveless life reaches its pinnacle in the tragic tale of Leto II, the God Emperor. At the end of Children of Dune, the final step towards the Golden Path that Paul was too afraid to take was to put on the sandworm as a second skin and become a worm himself. Yeah, it sounds pretty weird. And quite frankly, it is pretty weird. By becoming the worm, Leto is inundated with an almost constant stream of spice going through his blood, which gives him an immense knowledge of the future, the past, and the way that humanity is going to go, as well as near invincibility from violence and aging. However much he gains, though, Leto loses far more in this deal, including his ability to reproduce. For political reasons, in the very beginning of his reign, he marries his sister Ghanima, but their relationship remains completely platonic. He takes on a few different wives throughout his thousands of years of life, but these relationships are unable to grow too deep because of the fundamental species difference between them. And of course the fact that he is immortal and they will die. By the time of God Emperor of Dune, he has little company outside of his devoted army of soldiers and his personal attendants. That is, until the arrival of the woman, Hui Nori. Hui is the new Ixian ambassador, and from the moment they meet, Leto recognizes that she is different. Hui Nori has been especially bred by the Ixians to target Leto's one weakness: his desire for love. Even knowing this, knowing that she is a weapon specifically created to weaken him, Leto cannot help himself. He falls in love with her almost immediately. She is sweet, empathetic, beautiful, and kind, and despite what she was created for, Leto loves her more than he has loved anyone in centuries. Hui's affection for Leto, which is also quite genuine and quite true, is founded largely on pity. She learns of the sacrifices that Leto has made in order to guide humanity, of why he had to do what he has done, and her heart bleeds for him. She loves him in her own way, and despite the differences in their species and the fact that they will never have a traditional relationship, she agrees to marry him. And despite their differences, despite the fact that Hui was originally engineered to be a tool for Leto's enemies, their love is something profoundly beautiful. Leto tells her, "Between the superhuman and the inhuman," he said, "I have had little space in which to be human. I thank you, gentle and lovely Hui, for this little space." But in the end, even this precarious, delicate love is ripped out of Leto's grasp. On the way to their wedding, the bridge that they are crossing is destroyed by revolutionaries. Leto knew that he would perish one day, and that he would not be able to predict how that would happen, but watching Hui Nori fall out of his arms to her death before him is an unbearable agony. As Leto tumbles down after her, he thinks, "I cannot cry, nor even shout. Tears are no longer possible. They're water. I'll have water enough in a moment. I can only moan in my grief. I am alone, more alone than ever before." This overarching theme of lost love and loneliness only becomes more and more grievous as it passes from one generation to the next. What begins as a whisper in the stilted relationship between the Duke Leto and Jessica mounts to a scream as Leto II tumbles to his death after an excruciatingly lonely life. By seeing this theme play out again and again in so many different characters' lives, Herbert allows this theme to be universal. We can all find some way to relate to one of these characters, and that makes the tragedy all the more profound. The final, most potent cycle that we're going to discuss is what Dune is all about. Herbert describes his saga as portraying the messianic convulsions that periodically overtake us. Even if we find a real hero, whatever, or whoever that may be, eventually fallible mortals take over the power structure that always comes into being around such a leader. This concept of human beings being dehumanized by the forces of the story around them, the process of forced deification, infuses Dune from its earliest pages. And it all begins with Wellington Yue, the doctor of the Atreides family, who history calls a traitor. And his actions were certainly traitorous. He betrayed the Atreides family, who he had been serving for years, cutting off their communication and allowing them to be ambushed and slaughtered by the Harkonnen family. However, the close lens of the story allows us to see that there is much more to Dr. Yue's story. The only reason he is turned traitor is because of his wife, who the Harkonnens have as a prisoner. He is painfully aware of how traitorous his actions are, of how no matter what he does, history is going to look at him as evil for the acts that he commits, but he still does what he can to save Jessica and Paul, and to give the Duke a way of fighting back against the Baron. Yue became trapped by the story. They needed a traitor, and Yue was the best candidate, but even if he had refused, somebody else would have taken up the mantle. With the full knowledge that he was damning himself in the eyes of every future generation, the story forced Yue's hand to commit an act of cruelty. However, this theme really finds its legs in the Atreides bloodline. The Atreides family is known for their stubborn bravery, their commitment to duty even in the face of death. The old Duke, Leto's father, was killed in a bullfighting match, and his son has held on to the head of this bull ever since, leaving his father's blood on its horns. It's there as a reminder that the Atreides will always face danger head on, even if it means certain destruction. Leto I carries this mentality from his home planet of Caladan all the way to Dune. He is well aware that he is walking into a trap. He's well aware that this will probably kill him, but duty compels him, so he goes anyway. And he is gored by the Harkonnen bull as payment for his bravery. Of course, as the Princess Irulan notes, the Duke Leto is only a precursor to his son. You see him there, a man snared by destiny, a lonely figure with his light dimmed behind the glory of his son. Still, one must ask, what is a son but an extension of the father? Paul Atreides never stood a chance against fate. Everything from his upbringing to his genetic makeup marked him out for greatness. He couldn't step out of the spotlight, no matter how much he wanted to, and by the time he and his mother find the Fremen in the desert, his feet are set on a path towards destruction. What's so much worse is that his spice-aided prescience allows him to see clearly just how inevitable this all is, how much he is just a tool in this larger machine. Paul found that he could no longer hate the Bene Gesserit, or the Emperor, or even the Harkonnens. They were all caught up in the need of their race to renew its scattered inheritance, to cross and mingle and infuse their bloodlines in a great new pooling of genes. And the race knew only one sure way for this. The ancient way, the tried and certain way that rolled over everything in its path. Jihad. Surely I cannot choose that way, he thought. But he saw again in his mind's eye the shrine of his father's skull and the violence with the green and black banner waving in its midst. They'll call me Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. As Muad'Dib, as the natural-born leader, Paul hopes to use his ill-begotten power to guide humanity away from this inevitability. He thinks if he gains enough control, he can stave off the imminent holy war. However, every attempt to guide that bull, to lead it in the right direction, just puts him more squarely in its path. In the end, he's forced to admit that his efforts to control the narrative have been futile. It was like some hideous contrivance with plastic memory. Shape it any way you wanted, but relax for a moment and it snapped into the ancient forms. Forces at work beyond his reach in human breasts eluded him and defied him. Just a few years after becoming emperor, Paul has the blood of over 60 billion people staining his hands, and he is left despondent. All that Paul really wanted in the end was to be treated as a human. He wanted to be Fremen, not Atreides. In Dune Messiah, when it had become clear that Paul was destined to be no more than a tool of fate, he would often disguise himself in classic Fremen garb and walk around the city unnoticed. He liked to be unimportant, to be irrelevant, to be seen as just a person, and to see what he had created from the outside. While in this disguise, Paul attends a religious ritual being held by his sister and is shaken to his core by the magnitude of what he has created. The collective mental atmosphere of the temple ate at his psyche. He could sense that element of himself which was one with those all around him, but the differences formed a deadly contradiction. He stood immersed, isolated in a personal sin which he could never expiate. The immensity of the universe outside the temple flooded his awareness. How could one man, one ritual, hope to knit such immensity into a garment fitted to all men? Paul shuddered. Just like his father, his grandfather, and the traitor Yue, Paul has become a slave to necessity. The story needed a figurehead, a dictator, a Lisan al-Gaib, a bullfighter, and Paul was forced into that position. Although godhood may seem glamorous, Paul sees it as much more of a curse. To become God, one must become inhuman. Although Paul was unable to completely escape the blow of the bull's horns, he also was not able to fully complete his part of the story. He didn't have the strength to pull that plug, to fully sacrifice his humanity to the golden path. He is still far too human, far too broken by the loss of his Sihaya, and he seeks the freedom of a clean death in the desert. This last-minute failure necessitates the continuation of the cycle, which finds itself in the life of Leto II, his son. And the story acknowledges that as much as Paul's wish for freedom was hopeless, this is even more true for his children. Stilgar, who has seen the rise and fall of Paul, seen his struggle with destiny, observes that the twins were merely the lens through which light poured to reveal new shapes in the universe. In so many ways, Leto is the more extreme version of Paul. Paul had glimpses of a normal childhood. He had a mother and a father. He had the chance to get to know his own mind without the effects of prescience. His son is not so lucky. He has all the voices of his ancestors inside him and has the responsibility of godhood thrust upon him from the cradle. He and his sister Ganima have no adult figures to guide them through their growing up. Instead, they allow the minds of their mother and father to possess them so that they can give advice to each other. They have no parents, no chance for childlike joy, no youth to speak of at all. go. And Leto feels this absence so keenly because he has the minds of his ancestors crowding his head. That means that he is well aware of what he is missing out on. The freedom, the love, and yet he sees no other route forward. Here was the great leap onto the golden path. He had put on the living, self-repairing stillsuit of a sand trout membrane, a thing of unmeasurable value on Arrakis, until you understood the price. I am no longer human. Leto allowed his humanity to be lost. He allowed himself to be seen as a worse traitor, a worse villain than Dr. Yue. While Leto's father, Paul, could walk among the Fremen unnoticed, could see his empire from the outside, Leto's difference made this impossible. He becomes the true Muad'Dib, guiding humanity's unwilling footsteps towards survival. And yet, the fulfillment of all his centuries of labor, the final step onto the golden path, comes from breaking those cycles entirely. After 3,500 years of crossing bloodlines under Leto's careful eye, a human being is finally born, who is invisible to prescience. This woman is named Siona Atreides, and she is the youngest Atreides from the long line that Leto has been breeding. Siona was the one person whose actions Leto couldn't see, couldn't predict, and she was necessary in order to break the cyclical trap of prescience entirely. But in order for Siona to strike out on her own path, she needed something to strike against. She needed Leto II to be a true villain. Leto became the epitome of the theocratic God Emperor, stamping out any individuality and making his father's genocidal cruelty look like child's play. Whether or not Leto himself was truly evil is something that can be debated and would probably have to be its own video entirely, but as Siona points out, his actions are unforgivable. Leto's inhuman actions push Siona to become the next in a long line of Atreides revolutionaries. Over the course of his reign, Leto's incomprehensible cruelty has caused almost every true-blooded Atreides to become revolutionaries, to plot against his downfall. It is simply in Atreides' nature that they will fight against tyrannical power, even if that means fighting their own ancestor. However, Leto needed a rebel, someone who wanted to fight back, not just out of rage or out of a feeling of injustice. He needed to find a true rebel. And to do that, he began testing the Atreides bloodline. This test involved taking the next member of the Atreides line and putting them through a spice trance, opening their minds to prescience. Their Atreides blood meant that their visions led them to see the full extent of the Golden Path. They would come around to understand Leto's actions, and in every case up until this point, they became loyal followers of the God Emperor. However, Leto's secret hope, the final step that he needed to reach, was to find an Atreides person that could see the Golden Path, could see what he was doing, but realize that his actions were unjust, no matter the cause. And Siona is that person. After the test, hatred for Leto and what he has done is still within her, unwavered even by all his reasoning. He saw the flame of rebellion return to her eyes. She did not have to feel guilty or dependent. She no longer could avoid belief in his golden path, but what difference did that make? His cruelties could not be forgiven. She could reject him, deny him a place in her family. He was not human, not like her at all. The trap of the Golden Path, the ever-worsening cycles of self-sacrifice for duty, comes to an end in Siona Atreides. After her test, she works with the resurrected Duncan Idaho to assassinate the God Emperor and free humanity at last. As he lays dying, the final shreds of Leto's humanity explain to Siona, "I give you a new kind of time, without parallels," he said. "It will always diverge. There will be no concurrent points on its curves. I give you the golden path. That is my gift. Never again will you have the kinds of concurrence that you once had." Leto asks Duncan what he's going to do with his newfound power, his newfound control, and he revels in the fact that despite his decades and centuries of prescience, he doesn't know the answer. He doesn't know what's coming next. The Atreides' curse of feeling obliged to face head-on against this bull reveals its true power when it is finally broken. As admirable as the Atreides are, and they are so heroic, Herbert tells us that the true path towards our survival, our golden path, lies in stepping out of the narrative cycle entirely. If our story really is a plastic memory, if we are destined to have it constantly snap back into the same ancient shapes, then maybe the answer is in bending it, in twisting it so hideously that it snaps apart entirely. Herbert describes seeing Dune as a fugue. In music, a fugue is usually based on a single theme that is played many different ways. Sometimes there are free voices that do fanciful dances around the interplay. There can be secondary themes and contrasts in harmony, rhythm, and melody. From the moment when a single voice introduces the primary theme, however, the whole is woven into a single fabric. In God Emperor of Dune, that fabric is ripped apart entirely, and humanity is set loose on the universe. Herbert's cyclical storytelling allows him to tackle incredibly complex ideas in a very digestible way. By introducing these ideas on a small scale, on a personal scale, they make sense to us even when expanded to cosmic levels. And yet, he also uses this device to show us the way that things like pain and trauma have a tendency to be passed on. If we do not confront our demons, they will persist, haunting generations to come. Dune puts on display the cyclical habits of humanity, the way that we fight the same battles, face the same struggles over and over again. But its most important reminder is that no cycle is inescapable, and sometimes the best thing to do is to break that cycle completely. This was a dense one, but to be honest, I really enjoyed putting it together. I have gotten so used to doing these deep dives about The Lord of the Rings that it is honestly so exciting to get to do that to a new piece of media and to get to really dive into a new story. So please let me know what aspects of Dune you want me to talk about next. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something new, consider giving this video a like because it really helps me out. And if you're interested, subscribe because I make videos about The Lord of the Rings and Dune and storytelling every single week, and I'd love to have you here. My Patreon is linked in the description if you want to support me that way, but honestly, just watching is so great. I'm so glad I get to share these stories with you. Thank you for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.